This place is different, and it is purer and more politically progressive and advanced than anywhere else in the world. And so don't look at our questionable origins. Look at what we're creating here and what we're going to become.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Few figures have left as powerful a mark on how Australians understand themselves as John Hirst. A formidable historian, teacher and polemicist, Hirst was never content just to sit quietly in the archives. He threw himself into the history wars, quarrelling with prevailing orthodoxies and confronting the assumptions of his peers. Yet, strikingly, even those who most disagreed with him still read him, an achievement unmatched by any comparable figure in Australian public life, perhaps. Historians play a decisive role in shaping a nation's story and mythology. They provide the stories through which people make sense of their past and, by extension, their future. In John Hirst's case, those stories centred on a paradox, a robust democracy growing out of a penal colony, a classless society that birthed class politics in the Labor Party, a federation often dismissed as a prosaic deal, but which he portrayed as a deeply romantic nation-building project. Hirst was at once combative and inspiring. He challenged the bleakest interpretations of our origins, rejecting the idea that Australia's story could be reduced to a tale of shame and dispossession. Instead, he sought to recover what was distinctive and admirable in our democratic tradition, the blending of order and rebellion, authority and egalitarianism, which continues to shape our national character. So today, to discuss John Hirst's legacy and to probe why his vision still matters, I'm joined by my colleague, Alex McDermott, who's a curator here at the Robert Menzies Institute. And Alex is also a professional historian and author who studied under John Hirst himself. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Alex.
Thank you, Georgina. It's great to be here.
And Alex, you've contributed to a book about John Hirst that was published earlier this year.
That's true, just this year.
He's quite a remarkable figure. And as I was preparing for this podcast, I was thinking about how important historians are, like individual historians are, to telling us Australians who we are, who our nation is, where it's come from, and their interpretations are so powerful. I mean, just think of what Geoffrey Blainey or Henry Reynolds has done to give us, I guess, two different interpretations.
Yeah, or Manning Clark.
And Manning Clark, of course, absolutely. So I guess to frame our discussion today, let's start with who was John Hirst?
Great question. Part of the beauty and paradox of John Hirst's telling of Australian history goes to the paradox of his origins and then the changes as he evolved throughout the course of his career, which he himself wrote about and talked about. He began in Adelaide in the 1950s and 60s at Adelaide University, and he was originally shaped by the orthodox historians who were teaching him at that point in time, who were predominantly from the left. In fact, three of his most significant teachers, Russell Ward, Ian Turner and Ross Golan, were all, as it turned out, active members of the Communist Party. So they were legit left-wing warriors. There was no doubts about it. And he said he absorbed a lot of their assumptions and became a sort of a Labor voting social democrat in the 1960s and early 1970s. Loved Gough Whitlam, was thrilled and elated by his election in 72 and outraged by his dismissal in 1975. And as he confessed at that time, couldn't conceive how a decent, right-thinking, right-minded person could possibly vote Liberal. So he was very much beginning from that point of view. But by his accounts, partly or largely through the experience of his encounter with the empirical past, by really drilling down into Australian history and asking unexpected questions and being willing to sort of cock his ear to the responses that the material then gave him, he began to first subtly and then significantly and dramatically change his points of view as his career went on. And so to me, this is part of the beauty of the Hirst style and the Hirst approach is he's got a fundamental open-mindedness and he doesn't carry many baked-in assumptions. And so the arguments that he then puts forward are quite fresh, largely in virtue of that.
It's an interesting journey, but it's not an uncommon one to go from a Marxist perspective to a liberal, smaller liberal, classical liberal perspective.
Frank Knopfelmacher is another of many who begin as Marxists. Keith Windshuttle was another, and then travel a long march to the other side of the political spectrum. That's true.
Those academics and historians, philosophers, what marks them out as ripe for that transformation from Marxism to liberalism?
Great, right. I think there's a couple of things. One is the shifts in the society around them that happen sort of on their watch, on their generational watch, and every generation experiences this. The things that are your cultural furniture in your 20s that you rely on as you construct your view of reality in the world, by the time you're in your 40s and 50s, many of them have inverted or collapsed or dissolved or tipped over. And that was certainly true for John Hirst. He describes how his instincts were in favour of what you'd call the old left traditional social democracies. So more opportunities for all and a more even spread of resources. But where he parted ways with the progressive left was beginning in the 1970s and into the 80s, what he called the liberationist revolution, which put more emphasis on differences and the increasing number of rights that people lay claim to, and less on civic duty and common shared identity. And I think the longer that Hirst's career went, the more he found that the essential patriotism that he was imbued with, that he took for granted when he was coming of age as a young Labourite, had really shifted with the new left's progressive approach. And coupled with that, he described his experience of, two other things. One, his experience of inquiring into the origins of Australia as a convict colony, which we can get to in a moment. But two, his experience as a father of a rebellious teenager. Mm-hmm. And that classic thing of finding out that there are certain situations where you're just trying to do the right thing and be a reasonable, decent parent, but that doesn't mitigate the ferocity of the rebellion that you're being exposed to. And that was another thing, along with the sort of the liberationist 60s and 70s, that began to shift his perspective on reality. I
often wonder if parenthood is the reason why people become more conservative the older they get, because they're all about, rights and freedoms and and identity and rebelliousness as a youngster. And then as you get older and you see your child try to push against authority and the like, or claim sort of identity as a kind of way of elevating some particular set of rights, you say, no.
Yeah,
let's adopt a much more conservative approach so I can kind of,
There's some obligations that are actually going to work.
Here. Yeah, exactly. And you want, kids to take responsibility for themselves and their future.
Absolutely.
And, imbue that in them. Before we get on to, I think, the way Australia developed and how he conceived of that development, which is fascinating, can you tell me how he, as a student of the 50s and 60s, how he grappled with that Australian nationalism that was really sort of resurgent around then, and then sort of pushback against Britain and empire. I mean, that was what the kind of trendies in the 50s and 60s, the left-leaners, they were quite nationalistic. They wanted Australia's own, culture and not to be a product of Britain, to be distinct.
Yeah. And in some ways, Hirst was part of that. And people talk about the quote-unquote new nationalism of the 1970s, particularly when Whitlam came in, but also beginning with John Gorton, especially prior to that, the desire to see our sense of our national identity as standalone Australian and no longer linked to Britain and the Empire.
And this, of course, is linked to a pushback against people like Robert Menzies, who are considered the old, empire men and
absolutely
Anglophilic, and we don't want to truck with the old guard. We want this shiny new Whitlam-esque, it's quintessentially Australian leadership.
That's it. It's the sort of the Horn lucky country view, which is we're a shabby second-rate lot. We're addicted to shabby second-rate ideas, and it's time to wake up, Australia.
Yeah,
that was very much current. Hirst shared that, but a couple of things sort of become apparent there. One, the new nationalism starts to run aground in the early to mid-1980s, it would seem to me, where it became more and more difficult, it seemed, for the mainstream left and many in the mainstream Australia to unashamedly celebrate the achievements of Australia and being Australian. And especially by the time of the bicentenary, there was fierce debate. That's around the time where you had the beginning of the only partially mythical history wars and the black armband view versus the white blindfold view and so forth.
And in the early 90s, you get the Mabo decision and all of these
and
big debates.
Led by Keating and John Howard. It was front and centre. And Hirst, again, I keep coming back to it, Hirst loved Australia. He was a dead-set, brilliant historian who didn't try and obscure and obstruct his view of what happened, but he was a civic patriot and he wanted to be able to love his country, to put it in sort of basic or blunt terms. And that drift in the mainstream and the progressive left really left him alienated. So there's that. And I suppose that the interesting difference there is Hirst was a Republican. He was one of the leading members of the Republican movement in the 1990s, leading up to the failed referendum to become a republic. But he was not greatly sympathetic to many of the views of his co-Republicans, who tended to come mostly or more than anywhere else from the sort of the urban intelligentsia and the educated cosmopolitan classes, as it were. And he felt they repudiated too much of Australia's past. And Hirst's view was we should become a republic to complete what's already been done by our forefathers and previous generations. So we complete federation, we complete these other great achievements, rather than we write them off and reject them and become a republic instead. And so again, there's that tension in him between the sort of his attachment to Australia and a definite cultural nationalism in his approach and his values, but also of a very fair appraisal and respect for what had come before as well.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's a really interesting approach to republicanism in Australia, that it is the natural evolution of from federation onwards.
It's interesting that it wasn't the dominant argument being made at the time.
No,
it was very much a more Whitlamite everything begins again sort of approach.
We want our head of state to be in Australia, not, some lady born in Britain.
So it's not the evolution argument. No. It's not a final gradual change. It's a dramatic shift.
Actually, I think Hirst's approach is a much more convincing one. So if you're a Republican listening,
scribble it down.
Scribble it down. Although I think it's on life support that cause these days.
Yeah.
So Hirst writes, his magnum opus is his History of Federation, the Sentimental Nation, but he also writes The Convict Society and Its Enemies and The Strange Birth of Colonial Democracy. And he explains this paradox of Australia as a thriving democracy that came out of a penal colony, which is a paradox.
It is,
we literally are a set of convicts and their prison officers. And Clive James famously says we're the descendants of prison officers, basically, because we love laws here and being law-abiding. There's that real paradox, though, that then we become, we think we're freedom-loving, although I think Americans might look at us and go, you ain't freedom-loving.
Yeah.
But tell me how he explains that.
Well, there's a whole bunch to unpack there, Georgina. He starts off with this question, which you just articulated, which is, how do we get to one of the most successful self-governing democracies anywhere in the world by starting from the mid-19th century, by the end of the 19th century, when we begin as a penal colony, with all the assumed sort of debased social relations that come with a servile settlement. And by his description, the more he looked into it, the more he realised he was asking the wrong question, because he realised in its origin, Australia wasn't a penal colony, even though it was populated dominantly with convicts. It was set up as an essentially free British colony, which happened to have convicts in its population. And so it was not set up under penal law or martial law. It was set up under civil law. And so one of the great landmark moments in Australian history, of course, is the first civil case brought just after the First Fleet arrives by Henry and Susanna Cable, who are convicts who had their luggage stolen, essentially, coming out in the First Fleet, and they sued the ship's captain, which back in England would never have happened because it was nuts. Convicts lost legal rights. They weren't able to sue ship's captains in court. But Phillip and Lord Sydney back in Downing Street had clearly worked out that if you're starting a colony dominantly with convicts, they need to have rights. Otherwise, you are just going to have a two-tier colony. And so Hirst inquires deeply into the archives and the resources, and what he finds is not entirely dissimilar to a parent struggling with rambunctious teenagers. He sees Governor Phillip trying to sustain basic order and fairness and decency in a newly established society where he had convicts and he had Marines, and the Marines refused to guard the convicts or have anything to do with them. They said, no, that's beneath our station. We're here to protect you against the French if they turn up and want to invade or something. Crowd control and keeping law and order, that's your problem. And so Phillip has no choice but to appoint convicts as policemen and overseers. And the whole attitude is encapsulated in those sort of first moments. And what you then have is a society where convicts they're not kept in gulags or jails. They are free to live in the general town of Sydney and surrounds, or with their assigned masters who are often ex-convicts themselves. And they have task work. They'll get up in the morning and do the work that they have to get done, but it's not set hours. So as soon as they're done, they can go off and they can laze about, they can go fishing, they can gamble, they can work for themselves, earn money. And very quickly you have convicts and then ex-convicts with a stake in the country, with a stake in the place, who are significant citizens and key businessmen and leaders and so forth. And that's the world that generates an essentially free society that is then able to make a transition to self-government and democracy without having to unwind a sort of a caste system or dismantle huge, enormous jails or things like that, because it hadn't actually begun as a penal gulag or colony.
There wasn't an enduring tension between free settlers and convicts. I mean, if you were a convict, you serve your time and then you say, I'm going to stay here in the colony of New South Wales or wherever and get some property. and then do well, but you
Yeah.
were always a convict. Was there that sense of hierarchy?
Of course you have tensions.
Yeah.
But the bulk of the free settlers aren't really arriving till the 1820s and 1830s. Until then, you've got a very small sprinkling of those who are arriving free as officers or as magistrates or other significant settlers. But the bulk of the free settlers were ex-convicts, or as time went on, the children of convicts and ex-convicts. So it was not an inheritable status. It was something that you transitioned out of and then largely joined the free society. Now, there were some restrictions such as ex-convicts couldn't sit on juries until the 1830s when Governor Burke said, no, it's time for them to be able to sit on juries as well, which freaked out and outraged the very respectable free settlers who kind of had a point. It's like, you've got ex-crims sitting on juries. What do you expect? But again, that's the particular nature of the place. So you have that, and then you had economic freedom and great economic success for convicts and ex-convicts in these first 3 to 4 decades. The only thing that the free settlers, who are constantly doing business, working with or even for these convicts, the only thing they could control was social exclusion. So they could have a tight little enclave and refuse to accept others into that charmed circle. So William Wentworth, son of a highwayman, was rejected by John MacArthur when he was making overtures to MacArthur's daughter for marriage, which set Wentworth off on arguably a lifelong campaign against the exclusives. But so you had
Bunyip aristocracy, wasn't it?
Say again?
He campaigned hard against the Bunyip aristocracy, didn't he?
Well, before sort of by the end ending up in it himself, of course. But yeah, exactly. So there's that. But I'll give you an example. Governor Macquarie turns up after the Bligh Rebellion in the 1810s, and as he later describes it, he turns up expecting this is going to be a debased colony and convicts are the problems, have to be controlled as tightly as possible. And he says he gets here and realises they're the ones they're the ones doing the work. They're the ones who are the upstanding members of the community. They're the life of the place, and their children are going to inherit this place. And he starts inviting ex-convicts to Government House. He starts appointing ex-convicts as magistrates, and there's outrage, there's uproar. But it's the outrage and uproar, to my mind, is the last gasp sort of outrage, rather than a systemic across-the-board division in society.
It must set a great, model for social mobility in Australia, that, you are able to be a convict and then an ex-convict,
Absolutely.
a magistrate, an upstanding member of society, that you can
100%.
rehabilitate yourself.
Yeah. And just on that, Georgina, that kind of leads us into one of the later things that John explored, which is talking about the emergence of the national character, but the emergence of the ALP and Australia as a quote-unquote working man's paradise, as it became known as by the mid to late 19th century. From the very jump, from the first convicts, labour was in high demand.
And that's LABOUR, as
right,
in.
Thank
as
you
in,
for the clarification.
Not Labor, the party, but
working,
Labor, as in.
Yes.
Human capital.
We needed
working
people. Hands.
Yes, working hands.
And that is a fundamental difference that in many ways defines the first century of Australian life, at least, up until the 1890s crash and great strikes and subsequent depression. And so you've got a real social mobility for ordinary people who are arriving, and not simply the elites who are in short order or in small number. So if you get off the boat in 1802 and you're a carpenter, Governor King may well be giving you a ticket of leave within a week, because we need carpenters. And he's not going to waste time assigning you to work as a shepherd or something when there are houses that need to be built and there's buildings that need to be built, there's harbours that need to be dealt with and so forth. And that's the pattern that really sets the tone. And so if you look at the first generation of convict entrepreneurs, they are, by and large, their origins are incredibly obscure and they're often illiterate, and they've come from the strata of society with the least going for them. And they get here, and the evidence of their experience and the evidence of their eyes is if you take your opportunities, if you work hard, if you make a go of it, you can rise. And then, of course, subsequent to that, you have the gold rushes of the mid-19th century. You've got this basic sense and this basic mentality that there's no stigma attached to obscure origins, or very little, hardly any stigma, and no stigma at all attached to manual labour, which is totally at variance with Britain and Europe and in significant ways America, where there's wealth and labour. Here it's much more fluid and free moving. And so another great paradox that Hirst unpacks for us is the question of how does the Labor Party, which is by its own self-definition a class-based party, the parliamentary party to represent organised working class, how does that take hold in a country which is one of the most classless places in the world and dominated by social mobility? And one of Hirst's answers is there's no stigma to being a worker or part of the working class. There's no stigma associated with manual work and being a manual worker. And so the genius of the early Labor Party, Andrew Fisher, Billy Hughes, Joseph Cook and others, is to essentially make their pitch to Australia to say we're on the side of not simply the working class, but all workers, everyone who's working. And that essentially, to the Australian ear, means all Australians. It's you're either working or you're in a family of a worker. And so up until the great conscription crisis in World War I, the Labor Party is able to sort of identify itself with this high valorisation of ordinary values and ordinary working people's aspirations, not connected to class affiliations, which are massively more weak in Australia than in Britain and other places.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting, I think, interpretation of how Labor cements its grip in the late 19th century in Australia. Not that necessarily we were just a country full of working class people and had a small middle class, but that actually Labor's pitch was to everyone who was working. There's this, the Clive James quote about we're all descended from prison officers and that's why we're all so obedient and law-abiding. And in the COVID-19 pandemic, we all seem very obedient and law-abiding. And,
did we what?
We certainly weren't the easy-go larrikins pushing against authority that we'd like to tell ourselves we are.
Well, Hirst would not have been surprised.
And Hirst would not have been surprised. So, what were these enduring impacts of convictism? Interesting word.
It's a word.
As far as Australia's cultural tendency towards obedience, do you think?
Okay, so Hirst cites a very early study by Henry Reynolds. One of the first things he ever did was to look at basically the social tone of Tasmania, essentially. Given that Van Diemen's Land and then Tasmania was the most heavily convictised, which is not a word, of any colony in Australia. It had the most convict sent to them, and yet it was the most socially conservative of the colonies. It had the most pronounced degree of rank and deference out of any. And so that sort of indicates that a lot of people tend to assume, we're rebellious larrikins because we start as a pack of convict rebels trying to overturn things. And Hirst's sustained argument is it's not the fact of being convicts that explains our supposed rebelliousness. And there is a larrikin smart-arsery, if you could put it like that, to the Australian character and the Australian way. But it's not that the fundamental grievance fury that seeks total revolution or overturning. And Hirst says that tone comes from the very uncontrollable or hard to control lower orders of the cities of Britain, particularly London, in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, where there was an enormous amount of urbanisation and the Industrial Revolution kicking in, and you had the old forms of agrarian status and hierarchy falling down. And so you had a lot of unconstrained behaviour by a lot of Cockney Londoners, essentially. And in a nutshell, that's Hirst's argument about what a foundational culture is for Australia that inflects us with that larrikin edge. But at the same time, he points to the fact that we are, even though we don't like admitting it to ourselves, profoundly obedient. We are notorious for forming orderly queues, for not jumping out of order, for doing what the rules, regulations and laws would tell us to. And Hirst's argument is that's because when Australia is being founded, basically is a revolution taking place in governance and in how states govern, certainly in Britain. So the old forms of government, which almost became a byword for corruption, old corruption it was called, or the thing, which Edmund Burke and others led reform campaigns against, were starting to be dismantled, and government and the state was beginning to be stripped down to what, say, William Gladstone championed, which was an effective state, but one that's not there to serve the interests of a particular caste or class, but to serve the public interest and to do it fairly, essentially, to all. And you find that sort of attitude very early, certainly by the time of the gold rushes in the 1850s, where these places you would expect and which historical myth has described as wild, crazed, rambunctious places were remarkably orderly and had very, very low rates of crime comparative to other parts of the world where there were gold rushes and what you'd expect. And Hirst's argument was people didn't mind obeying an impersonal state because they trusted it. They trusted it was going to do what was fair and decent because that was their experience in colonial Australia. What they wouldn't wear was people taking on personal airs and trying to pivot off status, individual status and authority. So you had, at the same time as you had like a very obedient people, you also had the evolution of what Hirst called the democracy of manners, which was, regardless of what differences we might have in origin or in everything else, we would make a point of treating each other as equals and emphasising what we have in common and what we share rather than the things that divide us. And that became definitional to Hirst's mind for the Australian culture and the Australian way of life.
I mean, I guess that goes on to the journey to federation, doesn't it? One of the core aspects of federation, the first piece of legislation that the new Commonwealth of Australia, the government passed, well, the Parliament passed, was the White Australia policy.
True. Yeah.
And this sort of idea that we are a racist country, we're
Right.
intolerant, we don't give rights to to Indigenous Australians and the like. It's a view that has developed more and more, I think, as you were saying, since the 80s and 90s to be one of sort of received narrative, and we're hypersensitive to how we're viewed in the world, and that our immigration policy, even to this day, treatment of refugees, speaks to a sort of an inbuilt racism that we just can't shake off. I mean, Hirst takes a very different view. As you said, it's sort of this idea of Australia with democracy of manners.
Democracy of manners.
And that we have actually in our founding story an amazing, unique tolerance of other cultures and other religions. Can you explain
how
that?
Explain this?
Yeah,
Yes.
that how he was really romantic about this journey to federation and sees white Australia, like the emphasis on white Australia, as as wrong, basically.
Mistaken.
Yeah, it's misleading.
Yeah, it's one of the myths he was at pains to debunk, that federation was essentially a vehicle to achieve a white Australia, and that it was basically just a business deal by sectional interests. Let's talk about the question of race and white Australia. Hirst argued that it was massively underappreciated or even unknown, the degree to which Australians generated remarkable or distinctive capacities for tolerance and modes of toleration, again from the foundational decades, because they were not a monolithic, homogenous whole. From the jump, they were a very divided people in the sense that they contained groups who had been warring for literally 4 centuries. So here I'm speaking of Irish Catholics, I'm speaking of Scottish Protestants and English Protestants, and the sort of ethno-sectarian divisions and violence and warfare that went back centuries was the defining feature of the relations between these groups of people who had no experience of integrating together and living together in a cohesive community. But in Australia, they had no choice. From the jump, a third of the Australian population is made up of Irish Catholics, which is a significantly large minority. And there was certainly comparative to places like the United States and Canada and Britain, there was no ghettoisation. It was the different groups lived together, cohabited, worked together, intermarried, and the like. And this meant that on the cultural level of basic, everyday, face-to-face interactions, people had to work out ways of living with traditional enemies and getting along. And so that was one component at the foundation decades of Australian life. And another component was you had this new refined, reformed, energetic British government that was also insistent on not replicating these old divisions. So again, Governor Burke disestablishes the Anglican Church essentially in 1835 and makes the then sort of revolutionary decision to allocate resources to Anglicans and Catholics and dissenters equally, and later the Jews as well. And so again, that's written into our sort of our public DNA and our colonial DNA from very early on. And to Hirst's mind, that's the real origin for the great 20th century success story of multiculturalism and the post-World War II migration program. It's not that we were just a restricted set of racist whites who then had to be taught how to tolerate people who were different to ourselves. It was we were already very well practiced in doing that with others who were traditional enemies before this immigration revolution began. And that's the key to understanding that later success. Now, the question of white Australia and the white Australia policy, Hirst's argument is, again, another paradox. It's arguably had more to do with the convict stigma than anything else. Now, that's not to discountenance the fact that late 19th century era of social Darwinism, eugenics, and other pseudosciences emerging that are placing too much premium on distinctions of race and scientifically false distinctions of race. And if you look at the public conversation across the world at that time, America, New Zealand, Canada, Britain, Europe, etc., it's everywhere. And Australia's not immune to that at a time when they are establishing their own nation. But federation was not a project to realise a white Australia because, in blunt terms, that had already been effectively achieved by 1888. The colonies had already agreed, all right, we can work out ways of keeping it. At that point in time, it was Chinese who they were worried about coming in and causing disintegration in a hard-won social cohesive community. So that had already been achieved. But the difference for Australia is we invent an immigration policy and glorify it and talk it up, say it's a white Australia policy as some great achievement. And there's no white New Zealand policy, there's no white Canada policy. And so what is it about Australia that sort of fixates on this term? And Hirst's argument is, even though the reality of being a convict colony, as he'd already worked out, was nothing to be ashamed of, in the eyes of the world, you can't get past the stigma of being a convict in your foundation. And
so this is like effectively whitewashing, no pun intended, our convict past by saying we're white Australia. So we're going to downplay the convict element,
right.
and put the fact that we are, a land for the white man.
It's an emphasis on purity.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what you see from the 1870s and 1880s is a sort of a civic nationalism that is emphatic that this place is different and it is purer and more politically progressive and advanced than anywhere else in the world. And so don't look at our questionable origins. Look at what we're creating here and what we're going to become. And so the images that were used were very often sort of a pure young white maiden, a sort of a young girl, rather than the heavy masculinist images which, say, Henry Lawson and Banjo Patterson were using at the same time. And so it was a preoccupation with purity and progress, and then it gets racialised and connected to an immigration policy, which then becomes the White Australia policy. But the origins are quite different from what you'd expect.
Yeah, and I think it's important to reflect that this was not an uncommon immigration policy to adopt of that era either. Alex, the final question I have of you about John Hirst, and one of, I guess, the still big history wars questions to this day, is that idea of British settlers coming in, invading Australia, dispossessing Indigenous Australians, frontier wars, the slaughter, the today intergenerational trauma of dispossession and stolen generations, of course, of the 19th century, that these are an original sin of Australia, the nation of Australia, one from which we can never escape. We are always illegitimate or, sinful, and that we should continue to apologise and contextualise our existence because of that, versus another approach, which is that we have an inspirational and positive story, and that the dispossession of Indigenous Australians, tragic as it was an inevitability of that era. And yes, we should acknowledge that there have been terrible deprivations of rights and liberties of Indigenous Australians, but the invasion story is not unique to Australia, but it's also shouldn't question the legitimacy of Australia as a nation and as a nation-building project.
Yeah. Okay. So Hirst's angle was conquest happened. He called it that. Dispossession, invasion, those hard terms. He was quite comfortable with using those as terms. He says that was a reality. But does that mean that everything that follows is illegitimate? And he fundamentally disagreed with that. And part of his reasoning was you can't apologise for an event which caused you to be. The critic can't criticise the thing that's created him or her subsequently. And he says, essentially, this is a foundational act. This original conquest happened, and everything that we the subsequent generations now enjoy and benefit from is directly inherited from that. And so you can apologise if you want, but it's kind of hypocritical, is Hirst's angle on that. But unless you want to just renounce everything and leave Australia and go and find somewhere else, because there's, as Hirst said, there's literally no ground that you can stand on in Australia and repudiate that first act. And he was critical of one central component of, for instance, the Mabo judgment, which on one level established the sovereignty of the Crown, said it happened, and wherever there was British settlements, then the sort of original sovereignty is negated, and the Crown is now the sovereign. But it also, in its judgment, said the violence with which it was perpetrated of the dispossession diminishes us and continues to diminish us until we make reparations or we are properly apologetic. And to Hirst, this was just nuts. He called it the progressive, the left liberal fantasy, that it would have in some way have been possible to establish a modern settlement that has now become Australia or something like Australia in a way that was not violent and did not involve dispossession. And some people pointed to treaties and said, well, you have treaties in other countries.
Like New Zealand.
Such as New Zealand.
Waitangi,
yeah. With the Maori, and also the United States, where from 1823 it was declared that Indians had ownership of their land, and if you wanted to acquire it, you needed a treaty or some form of agreement. And Hirst points to these other places and essentially says, see, what is the difference there? In the United States, what transpired was a series of forced treaties and no diminution or dilution of violent dispossession. And as a fundamental misapprehension of the basic reality, as Hirst saw it, of the foundational fact of Australia and Australian life.
Alex McDermott, it's been fascinating to visit the thinking and ideas of John Hirst, a really significant Australian historian and someone who was and continues to this day to be, a key intellectual leader in the debates over our history. So thank you very much for your time today.
A great pleasure. Thank you, Pat.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast at the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.